I didn't actually realize until quite later in life, certainly for the kind of realization I'm talking about my parents and what they had gone through in order to be married. I never thought of my mother and father as being a very romantic or loving couple. Only occasionally, when we were walking along, I'd see my mother link. That means put her hand through my father's arm, and link is what it was called in the north of England. And I didn't realize that they had suffered a great deal in order to enjoy being married together, although sometimes it didn't seem like they were enjoying it very much. The, the problem was, so if you realize that, if you understand that I was born in 1939, so we're looking at a long time ago. Now, if I was born in 1939 and my mother my mother uh, had me, I guess, uh, in her 30s or something like that. I grew up really being quite ignorant of how my parents were. And the big thing that I didn't know was that one of them, and I never knew which, because it was as it was, so I didn't need to know. Either my father was a Protestant and my mother a Catholic, or the other way around. Now, nowadays, we think of a mixed marriage as being mixed cultures. Like Beth and I are married. I'm uh, I'm an English-born Irishman, and she is Filipino, but I would be regarded as being Caucasian. So white. Gosh, we don't say these words, do we? And Beth is a Filipino. Now, my father and mother were not mixed, but they had a mixed marriage. And back then, the animosity, the enmity between the Irish or Northern Irish and the English was it was huge. It was deadly. Um, the Irish had the IRA, which was a deadly fighting force, and so it was difficult for my mother and father to be married because one half of the marriage, all of the relatives would be Catholic, who hated the other side, which was Protestant. So it was that. But what I'm leading up to is that they didn't bear animosity. I never heard them say, "Yeah, well, you're nothing but a bloody Irishman," or I never heard any of that. So I never heard any prejudice. And it was only later times in life that I realized that I was brought up in an atmosphere of no racial prejudice. I just didn't know anything. I was completely ignorant. I wasn't shielded and sheltered from it. It didn't exist for me. In fact, you have to understand the context that I'm talking now. I didn't actually know that I was English. I'm talking about when I was a little kid. I didn't know that I was English. I mean, I knew that my parents had some Irish in them, but I didn't particularly feel that it had any relevance in my life. So I never thought about it. I didn't go around and keep saying to people, "Yeah, well, I'm um, I'm an Englishman." It never occurred to me. And I remember how in my life, in various times, my ignorance of various ethnic, national, racial uh, people, I didn't actually know. I'm going to skip backwards and forwards in time now because it doesn't really very boring to say, yes, well, when I was 4 years old, it won't work for me. But I remember that my mother absolutely adored and respected and just thought so much of our doctor. And our doctor, in those days, you had a family doctor, and he took care of the family. And if anything went wrong, if someone was sick, like once I was quite sick, I don't know what was wrong with me, but I was in bed and I was delirious and floating around the ceiling. And Dr. Chamaret came out to tend to me. And I remember literally floating up on the ceiling, looking down on myself in the bed, and at my parents standing at the bedroom door and speaking with great respect to Dr. Chamaret, who was talking to them about how I'd be fine, and he'd given me this or that, and nothing to worry about, and it would pass, and all of that. What I didn't know was that he was a Jew. Now, this brings me to another thing. I've worked for a lot of Jews, and it seems to me that the word Jew is considered, if you say to a Jew, oh, you're a Jew, and it's almost as if that's an insult. So you would say, are you Jewish? And that's fine. So Jews don't mind being called Jewish, but they don't seem to like or seem to take some offence, in my experience, that they are being called a Jew. Now, when I later became a musician, I've lost count. It's that old example, isn't it? Ah, yes, I wish I had $1 for every Jewish function I've done. I played for birthdays, bar mitzvahs, which is a special time when a Jewish boy becomes a man, and I played for entirely Jewish audiences, and at the end of every gig, we always played the Artekva, which is the Jewish national anthem. I've even sung songs in Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew, but back then I had a very good ear for hearing phonetically how something had to be sung. So I would write it down phonetically. It would look like nonsense to anybody else, and then I would learn it phonetically, and I'd be able to speak it, and apparently do quite a good job of it. So where I learned about this thing, about the Jewish thing, was that I left school, a Catholic school, St. Wilfrid's, and I left St. Wilfrid's at the age of 15. And my first job was in a clothing manufacturer's, and I found that quite interesting. I actually went on and started to learn to use a machine, but I had another chance to go for a job that was going to be much better paid, and that was in the coal mines. Now, at 15, that wouldn't happen if coal mines were in operation now. It wouldn't happen now. Lots of things that I did then would not be allowed now. But I went into the coal mines. Now, what that entailed was going to the Robin Hood pit. I mention these by name when I remember them because there are people who are watching this and listening and say, I know that. And the Robin Hood pit, I had to go through Salford in order to get there. Can't remember the actual area that it was in, but it was called the Robin Hood pit, and it was a training pit. And I did my training. I completed my training as someone who was able and fully trained to go on haulage. And when I went down the pit, I learned to handle what we called the tubs, which were those little containers on wheels which brought the coal up from the coal face, and it brought it on a long line which sometimes travelled along the ground and sometimes was an overhead thing, but the same kind of hookup applied, and I was trained to do that, and that was quite an adventure. But something about that made my father write a letter, and I think it was I was coming home, even in training. There at the Robin Hood pit at that time, there was no shower facilities for the trainees, so they came in, they did what they did, they went down the pit, they did their training, and they came as they were, however they were, and they travelled home by the bus, usually in a seat on their own, because nobody would sit next to them. And that was it. Of course, I would get home. 15-year-old kids, even then, a day's work was very, very difficult. We'd been sitting in a school for all of our lives up to then. So I was pretty exhausted. In order to get clean, I used to go to the public baths, and I would pay my couple of pennies, and back then you would be given a bath, a private bath with an enormous bath. An attendant would come in, he would put the plug in, he would fill the bath with hot water, to which you could add cold water to your taste, and you could have a bath. And when I used to do that, I used to go and my 2 pence would take me in for a swim as well. So that was every night, and I grew up, for that time at least, being able to go swimming. Well, it seems a long way round, but it always is with me, because other things crop up that I want to comment on. But I was trying to give you a handle on how my parents didn't seem to have any prejudice. I never heard the word kike for a Jew. I never heard my mother or my father say Jew boy, which was very prevalent then. And I somehow, in the schools that I went to, I never heard it either. And I didn't know what the word wop meant, that it meant an Italian. I think my mother used to say, she used to call Italians the eye ties, which didn't seem so insulting to me. Anyway, blacks never came into it. She didn't know any black people. And then later in my life, the British government helped to import labour from, I think, the Caribbean countries. So Caribbean black people came over, and they were as they are, and they lived in little close communities. But my mother never disparaged them. I never heard her call anybody, so I didn't know anybody was good or bad. I had to learn that later. And the point that I was getting to was, when I went to a particular school, the family got a council house, which was a wonderful thing in those days. And we went to live near Manchester Airport, which was called Ringway back then. And it was just a little tin pot airfield, really, back then. Well, when we got there, it was a wonderful place for a child. People all around, in the opposite of the house that we lived in, houses were still being built. So our adventure playground was incredible, and I loved it. We moved from there because my father could not find work. He couldn't get to work. We moved back into a place called Moss Side, which back then was not highly regarded. Moss Side wasn't exactly a slum. and yet it was lots of row after row after row of terraced houses that were very modest indeed. And anyway, back to the school that I went to in Woodhouse Park. Now, when I was there, we did sports, and once again, I had no prejudices built in, and the most admired boy was Chris, and there was something special about Chris. He was an incredible athlete. He could run faster than any kid. He could hit a ball with a bat. He could play cricket. He could play football. Chris was just everybody's hero. Everybody wanted to be Chris. He was just so admired. We just all the boys just loved him, and you have to come now, fast forward to when I'd learned a lot about cags and wops and so on, and had failed to question any of those. What's the difference? When I started work at that first job, making clothes, within just weeks of joining that company as a 15-year-old, they had a works outing to Blackpool. And I palled up with an older boy who confided in me when he asked me not to tell anybody that he'd eaten a pork pie. For me, I didn't know what he was talking. Well, what's wrong with the pork pie then? Well, just don't tell anybody that I had pork. Well, what's wrong with pork? He said, well, I'm not supposed to eat it. Why? Well, it's because I'm Jewish. What's that? You can see how it was only then just creeping up on me. But at a later time, when I've been around a lot of people who were saying a lot of different things, and that's where I learned the various sayings of how, in a derogatory way, we pigeonholed everybody who wasn't the same as us. And I remember I was on leave from the army because I joined the army just after I had finished my training as a coal miner. In fact, I was due to start at Bradford Pit on the Monday, and on the Saturday I went for my examination and was accepted for the army. So I didn't go for my job as a coal miner, and I went there. So I'd already come back on my first leave just before going to Germany with the army. So I was my rank was boy soldier. More accurately, later I would be a band boy, because I actually didn't go I went to the infantry, but I didn't go as a soldier. I went as a musician, even though I didn't know anything about music. That's where I learned. And I remember being on the road in Moss Side, where the family now lived. And I looked across the road, and there was a couple of young men around my age, in the 15 mark. And I looked and I thought, there's a big greasy Greek. And no sooner had I said it, the one that I had called, not out loud, just in my mind, he's a greasy Greek. He's a greasy Greek, that's it. They're all greasers. Because he had long sideburns and thick He had thick curly hair and he was a brown colour. And it was like a thunderbolt to me. I realised that I knew him. He was the hero of my childhood. It was Chris. And I realised then how much I had admired him for what he was. Not because of what somebody said he was. I saw him and I admired him. And it was a great shock to me to know that my thinking had been so twisted that I would think so badly now. Later, I went to the School of Music when I was in the army. And in 59-60, I had 1 year of top musical education. And my teacher, a trombone, was the principal trombone of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, a man of great talent. He had perfect pitch. When I was playing the trombone, he wouldn't look at me. He'd look out the window like this, and I would be over there, and he would be listening. And he would say, "Don't play the D in the first position when you can play it in the fourth." How did he know? Because he had perfect pitch. And it turned out, as an aside, it turned out that perfect pitch, all of the students knew what perfect pitch was, and we aspired to have perfect pitch. But of course, it is something that seems to be inbuilt. All of the other best musicians even have what's called relative pitch. Well, straight after that, and I must cut it short soon, we're already on 22 minutes, and I went to, in 1960, so 59-60, as the year came to the end for 60, for me to be into leaving the college. I went and I was sent to Africa, and I went to Nairobi. And when I got to Nairobi, I really learned what prejudice and racism is really about, because I got there just after the band that I joined had returned from a place that was then called Bulawayo. And they had gone to Bulawayo on some kind of musical invitation gig. And then they came back and they told me what had been said, because they had arrived en masse, the entire band, whereas I came as a single person, so as a single entrant into the band, so I didn't get the full treatment. And they told me that when they had arrived in Bulawayo, they had been addressed by a sergeant major or sergeant, somebody in command, but not in an officer, not a commissioned officer. And he told them, if you are driving in Bulawayo and if you happen to run a black person over, I'm sure he didn't refer to it as a black person, but he said, if you do run somebody over, run back over them to make sure that they're dead. Because if you don't, you'll be responsible for that person's recovery. So in other words, they were given permission and instructions to kill another human being based on his colour. So that was the worst that I ever heard of colour. Now, years later when I came out of the army, I remember that I was at one point, I lived in Fort Myers, and I used to play in the band in Fort Myers in the Sanibel concert band. So every week I used to go over for a rehearsal to the concert band. And going over there, and I also did some work for someone that had been there all his life. And in talking to me about how things used to be, we passed a particular post, a post in the ground, like a lamppost. And he said, on that post, 20 years ago, there used to be a sign that said, if it is after 6 o'clock in the evening and you are black and reading this sign, oh, you better not be black if you are reading this sign. In other words, the guy that I was working with claimed that a black person could not be on the island of Sanibel after 6 o'clock. Amazing the progress that we've made. That's all. I hope that you will have enjoyed my little rambling. A few people had invited me to do what I used to call my meandering, where I just strolled about in my head and said whatever I wanted to. It works for me. I hope it did for you.